That summer, I thought my biggest concerns would be about getting ready for college or how to spend the last few weeks of freedom. But instead, I found myself in a situation I never could have imagined, one that would leave me questioning everything. It all started the summer I turned 18, the last summer before college, and a time I thought would be spent hanging out with friends and enjoying the freedom of youth. Little did I know that summer would change everything. My best friend Sam had invited me to spend a few weeks at his family's cabin. It was something we had done every year for as long as I could remember, boating, swimming, and hiking in the peaceful isolation of the woods. His family had always been like a second family to me, and their cabin a second home. But that summer, something shifted, something unexpected that I wasn't ready for. Sam's dad, Mr. Anderson James, as he preferred me to call him, was a strong, fit man in his mid-40s with an easygoing charm and a booming laugh that made him the kind of person everyone liked. He'd always been cool with me, joking around and treating me like one of his own kids. But this time, there was something different about how he acted, something subtle at first, but it was there. I just didn't recognize it for what it was. Not yet. It was a scorching July afternoon when Sam got a call from his girlfriend saying she needed his help with something back in town. "Do you mind if I head out for a couple of hours?" Sam asked as we sat by the dock, our legs dangling over the edge, the sun glistening off the lake. "I'll be back by dinner." "Go ahead," I shrugged. "I'll just hang here, maybe hit the sauna or something." They had recently added a small sauna by the lake, tucked away just past the boathouse. I'd used it a few times before, and it always helped me unwind. Sam's dad had talked about it nonstop since they had it installed, saying it was the perfect place to relax and sweat out the stress of life. "All right, cool. My dad's around if you need anything," Sam said, before he grabbed his car keys and headed up the gravel path to the driveway. I waved him off and wandered back toward the cabin, thinking how peaceful it was to be alone for a bit. The air was still. The sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees, the occasional ripple on the lake's surface, the only movement in the heat of the day. After lounging for a bit on the deck, I grabbed a towel and headed toward the sauna, excited to relax in the warm, humid air. When I got inside, I was hit with a familiar wave of heat that made my muscles instantly relax. I tossed my towel onto the bench and sat down, leaning back against the wall as I closed my eyes. The heat was soothing, the kind of warmth that seeps into your bones and makes all the stress melt away. For a while, I just sat there, alone with my thoughts, letting the heat do its work. But then, after maybe 15 minutes, the door to the sauna creaked open. I opened my eyes and saw James stepping inside, wearing just a towel around his waist, his body glistening with sweat. "Mind if I join?" he asked casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Sure," I stammered, sitting up a little straighter. I hadn't expected him to come in. After all, it was a small sauna, barely big enough for 2 people. But it was his place, so I figured I couldn't really say no. James sat down on the bench next to me, his towel hanging loosely around his waist. For a moment, we sat in silence, the heat between us thick and heavy. I tried to relax to focus on the warmth of the sauna, but something about his presence made me feel self-conscious. It was like the air had shifted, and I couldn't figure out why. "You look tense," James said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, calm, but there was something in his tone that made me feel uneasy. "You gotta let the heat work its magic. Loosen up a bit." "I'm fine," I replied, trying to sound relaxed, though my heart had started to pound in my chest for reasons I couldn't explain. James chuckled softly, leaning back against the bench. "You've used a sauna before, right?" "Yeah, a couple times," I answered, wiping the sweat from my brow. He nodded, glancing at me sideways, and for a second, his eyes lingered on me just a little too long. I told myself I was imagining it. He was just being friendly, like always, but then his leg brushed against mine. Not much, just a light touch, but I noticed it instantly. It was enough to make my skin tingle. I shifted slightly, moving over to give us more space, but James didn't seem to notice, or if he did, He didn't care. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his body glistening with sweat, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more intimate. "You know, I always find the sauna helps with more than just stress," he said, his eyes flicking toward me. "It helps clear your mind, relax your whole body." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded, swallowing hard. The air in the room felt even thicker now, the heat pressing down on me, making it hard to think straight. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything, but the tension was palpable. I could feel his presence, the heat from his body mixing with the steam in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something I hadn't expected. Then, out of nowhere, James reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady, his hand lingering just a little too long. My breath hitched, and I forced myself to stay calm. "Yeah, I'm fine." But his hand didn't move. Instead, it slid down from my shoulder, brushing lightly against my arm. I stiffened, unsure of what to do. This was my best friend's dad. This wasn't supposed to happen. "You seem a little tense," he said again, his fingers now tracing down my arm slowly, deliberately. "It's okay to relax. You're safe here." My heart raced, my mind spinning. Was this really happening? Was I misreading the situation? But there was no mistaking the way his touch lingered, how close he was sitting, the way his body pressed slightly against mine. I tried to shift away again, but the sauna was small, and there was nowhere to go. The heat, once comforting, now felt suffocating. My pulse quickened, my mouth dry as I searched for something to say, some way to stop whatever this was from happening. But I was frozen, caught in a moment I didn't fully understand. And then James leaned in closer, his hand still on my arm, and whispered, "You're a good-looking kid, you know that?" My body went rigid, my mind screaming at me to get up, to leave, to do something. But I didn't move. I couldn't. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, and the closeness between us was impossible to ignore. I felt trapped, like a deer caught in headlights, unable to break free. Before I could react, he shifted closer, his breath warm against my neck as he whispered, "It's just us here. No one has to know." His hand slid lower, resting on my thigh now, and my entire body tensed. The sauna, once a place of relaxation, had become a cage, and I was locked inside it with James, with his hand on my thigh and his breath hot against my skin. But the story didn't end there. This was only the beginning. I practically stumbled out of the sauna, my heart racing, and my thoughts tangled in a mess of confusion and guilt. The cool breeze hit my skin, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat that still clung to my body, but it did nothing to clear my head. My legs felt shaky, unsteady, like I was walking on uneven ground. I wrapped the towel tighter around me, as if it could shield me from the weight of what had just happened. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't process it. This was Sam's dad, my best friend's dad, and I had just let him kiss me. My mind was spinning, replaying the moment over and over again. The feel of his hands on me, the way he had leaned in so confidently, like he knew exactly what I would do, like he had done it before. The kiss lingered on my lips like a burning mark, impossible to wipe away. What had I been thinking? Why hadn't I pushed him off sooner? Why did I freeze like that? The questions piled up inside my head, each one louder and more urgent than the last, but none of them had answers. I had let it happen, and now I didn't know what to do. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast in my ears, as I walked toward the cabin. The path seemed longer than usual, the distance stretching out as if time itself was slowing down, forcing me to relive every second of what had just happened in the sauna. I felt like I was walking in a dream. No, more like a nightmare, one that I couldn't escape. When I finally reached the cabin, I paused at the door, hesitating for a moment before going inside. My fingers trembled as I gripped the doorknob, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. I didn't know how I was going to face anyone, least of all Sam. What if he could tell? What if he could see it written all over my face? I shook my head. No! There was no way. No one would know. I could keep this buried deep inside, pretend like it never happened. I had to. There was no other option. If Sam ever found out what had happened between his dad and me, it would destroy everything, our friendship, his family, and me. As soon as I stepped into the cabin, the familiar smell of wood and pine greeted me, and for a split second, I thought maybe I could just forget about the whole thing. Maybe if I didn't think about it, it would disappear. But I knew better than that. The moment replayed in my mind, relentless, like it was burned into my memory. I quickly got dressed, pulling on my clothes as if covering myself up would somehow erase the feeling of James' touch. But it didn't. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the sensation of his hands on my skin, the heat of his breath on my neck. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, my mind a storm of thoughts. How had things gone so wrong so fast? This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't me. I wasn't supposed to feel like this. But as much as I tried to deny it, there was a part of me, one I didn't want to acknowledge, that had felt something when he kissed me, a part of me that had wanted it, and that scared me more than anything else. But there was more. I wasn't just scared of what had happened. I was terrified of what would happen next. James had made it clear that no one had to know, but he hadn't said anything about what came next. Would he try something again? What if Sam came back and said something was off? What would I say? As if on cue, I heard the sound of gravel crunching under tires. My heart skipped a beat. Sam was back. I jumped up from the bed, trying to pull myself together. I didn't have time to think or plan. I just had to act normal, like nothing had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down, to push everything that had just happened into the back of my mind. The front door creaked open and Sam walked in, his usual laid-back grin on his face. "Hey, man, what's up?" he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "Hope you weren't too bored without me." I forced a smile, my heart still racing beneath the surface. "Nah, it was fine. Just hung out, hit the sauna for a bit." Sam nodded, oblivious to the turmoil going on inside me. Cool. You up for dinner? My dad's probably out back grilling something by now." His dad. The mention of him sent a jolt of panic through me, but I swallowed it down, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Yeah, sure, I could eat." We headed outside, and sure enough, there was James, standing by the grill, flipping burgers like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When James saw me, a smile spread across his face, but there was something in his eyes, something I hadn't noticed before, a look that sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't just acting normal. He was confident, like he knew he had control now, like he knew I wasn't going to say anything. "Hey, you two," James called out, his voice as easygoing as ever. "Burgers are almost done. Grab a couple of beers from the cooler, would ya?" I nodded, trying to keep my hands from shaking as I walked over to the cooler. Sam chatted away with his dad, completely unaware of the undercurrent of tension between us. Every word they exchanged felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when something would slip, when everything would come crashing down. As I handed Sam his beer, I couldn't help but glance over at James. He caught my eye, holding my gaze for just a second longer than necessary. It was a small thing, something Sam wouldn't notice, but it was enough to send my heart racing again. Dinner was a blur. Sam talked about his girlfriend, the plans they had for the rest of the summer, and how excited he was for college. I nodded and laughed at all the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, stuck in that sauna replaying the moment James kissed me. I couldn't shake it, couldn't forget it. And then, as we sat around the fire pit later that night, roasting marshmallows, James leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. He glanced at me again, that same knowing look in his eyes. "You know, the sauna's always open if you need to relax again," he said casually, his voice smooth and calm, like he wasn't just throwing out an invitation to continue what had happened earlier. I froze for a split second, my stomach twisting into knots. Was he serious? Was he testing me? Seeing if I'd take him up on it? But before I could respond, Sam laughed, completely unaware of the subtext. "Dude, you're obsessed with that sauna," he said, shaking his head at his dad. "You spend more time there than anyone else." James chuckled, his eyes still locked on mine. "It's good for the body and the mind. Helps you clear your head." I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, maybe. Maybe another time." James didn't say anything, but the message was clear. He wasn't done. He wasn't going to let this go, and now I was trapped, caught in a web I hadn't seen coming with no way out. But the story didn't end there. Not even close. The days that followed were a haze, filled with the kind of tension that never seemed to break. I couldn't escape the feeling that something had changed between me and Sam's dad, James. Something unspoken, but impossible to ignore. I tried to act normal, to keep everything locked down inside, but I could feel it weighing on me every time I caught him looking at me, every time I heard his voice. I kept telling myself that it had been a mistake. I wasn't supposed to feel the way I did, wasn't supposed to react the way I had. But the more I tried to bury it, the more it clawed its way back to the surface. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, always there, reminding me of what had happened in the sauna, and reminding me that it wasn't over, because James wasn't letting it go. I could feel it in the way he watched me, the way he always seemed to be just a little too close. And there was that look, casual on the surface, but beneath it, there was something else, a knowing, a confidence that I wouldn't say anything. And I hated that he was right. I didn't say a word to Sam. How could I? This was his dad, the man who had been like a second father to me for years. How could I destroy that? And yet, every day, I felt like I was walking on a nice edge, waiting for something to tip me over. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything other than what had happened in that sauna and the fear that it would happen again. But then one afternoon, it did. Sam and I had been out all morning, hiking the trails around the lake. It was one of those hot, sticky summer days where the air felt thick and heavy, and by the time we got back to the cabin, we were both drenched in sweat. "I'm going to take a quick shower," Sam said, tossing his backpack on the porch. "Then we can grab lunch, cool?" "Yeah, sounds good," I muttered, distracted. My mind was already elsewhere, thinking about what I'd been dreading all week, being alone with James. Sure enough, as soon as Sam disappeared into the cabin, I felt James' presence behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing on the deck, a towel slung over his shoulder, his shirt off, sweat glistening on his skin. He didn't say anything at first, just gave me that same look that made my stomach twist into knots. "You look like you could use some time in the sauna again," he said, his voice casual. But there was that edge again, like he was daring me to say no. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what he was doing. He was testing me, pushing me, seeing how far he could go. I should have walked away right then. I should have said something, made an excuse, done anything to get out of it. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, unable to find my voice. And that's when James made his move. "You know," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping lower, "there's nothing wrong with letting go. You don't have to fight it." His hand brushed against my arm, and that same rush of heat surged through me, the same confusing mix of fear and something else, something darker. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, but James followed, closing the distance between us. I could feel the weight of his presence, the way he loomed over me, like he knew exactly what was going to happen. "James," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't think, but he didn't let me finish. Before I could say another word, his hand was on my shoulder, his grip firm but not forceful, guiding me toward the sauna. "Relax," he murmured. "It's just us." I should have said no. I should have pushed him away, walked back into that cabin, and locked the door behind me. But instead, I let him lead me. I let him take control like I had no say in the matter, even though every part of me was screaming that this was wrong. The moment we stepped into the sauna, the heat hit me again, suffocating and intense. But it wasn't just the heat from the room. It was the heat between us. The tension had built to a point where it felt like the air itself was vibrating with it. James didn't waste any time. As soon as the door clicked shut, he was on me, his hands sliding up my arms, pulling me closer. I could feel the roughness of his skin, the strength in his grip, and I was powerless to stop it. My mind was spinning, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't make sense of, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine again. It wasn't soft this time. It wasn't a test. It was hard, demanding, and I felt myself responding before I could stop it. I kissed him back, even though I knew it was wrong. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, the sweat between us, and everything in me was telling me to get out. But my body wasn't listening. My heart was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I couldn't breathe. And that's when it happened. In that hot, steamy room, with the door closed and no one around, James didn't just kiss me. He crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His hand slid lower, gripping me in a way that was far from innocent. I froze, my mind screaming at me to get out, to push him away, to do something, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the heat, the tension, the fear. James' breath was heavy against my neck, his hands gripping me tighter as he whispered, "No one ever has to know. It's just us." I was shaking. Every muscle in my body was tense, screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I was caught in his grip, unable to break free, and he knew it. He knew he had me exactly where he wanted me. For a moment, I thought I might let it happen. I thought I might give in. But then, out of nowhere, I found the strength to push him off. "I can't," I gasped, my voice trembling as I stumbled away from him, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "I can't do this." James stared at me, his expression unreadable, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just watched me as I grabbed my towel and rushed toward the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the handle. I practically fell out of the sauna, gasping for air as the cool breeze hit my skin. My entire body was trembling, my mind racing as I ran back to the cabin, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was inside. The door closed behind me, and even then I couldn't breathe. Sam came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, completely oblivious to what had just happened. He smiled at me, his usual carefree grin, and I tried to smile back, but I couldn't. Not really, because the truth was nothing would ever be the same. What happened in that sauna had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and I knew deep down that I couldn't keep it buried forever. But for now, it will stay my secret. Our secret. The days that followed felt like I was living in a fog. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel James' hands on me, his breath on my neck, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like I was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, a getaway from the real world, but now it felt like a prison, suffocating me with the secret I had to carry. I kept telling myself that it was over, that I had pushed him away and stopped it before it went too far. But deep down, I knew better. The way James had looked at me, the way he'd smiled when I rushed out of the sauna. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't done. He was just waiting for the next moment, waiting for me to slip back into that vulnerable space where he could corner me again. And every day I felt like I was getting closer to breaking. Sam, on the other hand, was completely oblivious. He went about our days like nothing was wrong, like his dad hadn't crossed every line that should never have been crossed. We spent our time boating on the lake, playing cards on the deck, and laughing over old memories. But beneath it all, there was this growing tension inside me, a constant reminder of what had happened and what could happen again. I tried to shake it off, to push it to the back of my mind, but it was always there, and worse than that, every time I saw James, I felt that same uneasy pull, that tension in the pit of my stomach. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to set me on edge. I knew he was waiting for the right moment, and that thought alone kept me up at night. One afternoon, about a week after the sauna incident, Sam and I were lounging by the lake when he got a call from his girlfriend. He glanced at me, phone in hand, and shrugged. "Hey man, sorry." Claire wants to meet up in town. I'll probably be gone for a few hours. You cool hanging out here?" I felt the panic rise in my chest. Sam leaving meant I'd be alone with James again, and after what had happened, the thought of that was unbearable. But I couldn't tell Sam that. I couldn't say anything. If he knew what had happened, it would destroy everything. "Yeah, no worries," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll just chill here. Maybe take the canoe out or something." Sam gave me a thumbs up and jogged back to the cabin to grab his stuff. My heart was already racing, but I tried to keep it together. Maybe James would leave me alone this time. Maybe nothing would happen. I repeated those thoughts to myself like a mantra, hoping that by some miracle it would be true. After Sam left, I stayed by the lake for a while, staring out at the water and trying to calm my nerves. I could hear the soft hum of the wind, the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been, but I couldn't relax. My mind was too busy replaying every interaction I'd had with James, every moment that had led me to this point. I decided to head back to the cabin, hoping to distract myself by watching TV or maybe taking a nap. But the second I stepped inside, I felt the familiar chill of anxiety. James was there, sitting at the kitchen table, a beer in his hand, looking as casual as ever. He glanced up when I walked in, and for a moment we just stared at each other. "Sam gone?" he asked, his voice calm, like we were having a normal conversation. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, he'll be back in a few hours." James smiled, and the way his eyes locked onto mine sent a shiver down my spine. "Good. Means we've got some time." I froze, my body tensed, and I could feel my pulse quicken, the panic rising inside me like a tidal wave. I didn't know what to say, what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out before something happened, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the floor. James stood up, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, almost teasing. "That's not going to work, you know." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I'm not avoiding you." He raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Sure you aren't." He took another step closer, his hand reaching out to brush against my arm, and I flinched. "You can relax." Like I said, no one has to know. I backed up, my heart racing, trying to put some distance between us. "James, Before I could finish, he closed the gap, his hand grabbing my arm, pulling me toward him. His grip was firm, not rough, but there was no mistaking the control he had in that moment. I could feel his breath on my neck, could see the look in his eyes, the same look he'd had in the sauna. "You're not going to stop me this time," he whispered, his voice low and filled with something dark. Fear shot through me like a jolt of electricity. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but all I could think was that I had to get away from him. "Now!" I yanked my arm free, taking a step back, but James didn't stop. He kept coming, his eyes locked on me like a predator closing in on its prey. I panicked, without thinking. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear James behind me, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor, and I knew I had to move faster. I threw the door open and ran out onto the porch, my mind screaming at me to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the gravel path leading to the boathouse. My legs felt weak, my lungs burning from the effort, but I couldn't slow down. The only thing that mattered was putting distance between me and James, getting away from the suffocating feeling of his presence. Finally, I reached the dock by the lake, collapsing onto the wooden planks, gasping for air. My body shook with adrenaline, my mind still racing, trying to process what had just happened. James had crossed the line again, and this time I had barely escaped. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew he wouldn't stop. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring out at the water, trying to calm myself down. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow over the lake. But all I could think about was what had just happened and what would happen next. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. I needed to leave. I needed to get out before James had another chance to corner me, before something worse happened. But how could I explain that to Sam? How could I leave without telling him the truth? The thought of telling Sam made my stomach twist into knots. He would never forgive me. He would hate me. I would lose my best friend. But if I stayed, if I let this continue, I wasn't sure I'd be able to live with myself. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and started walking back to the cabin. My mind was made up. I would leave. I didn't know how, and I didn't know what I'd tell Sam. But I knew I couldn't stay. Not with James here. Not after what had happened. As I walked up the path toward the cabin, I heard a car pull up. Sam was back. My heart pounded as I saw him get out of the car, smiling and waving at me like everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Not for me. Not for us. "Hey, man, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," Sam called out, laughing. I tried to force a smile, but it felt hollow. I couldn't tell him, not yet. But I knew that sooner or later, I would have to. I walked past him heading inside, my mind already spinning with excuses, with lies I would have to tell to protect myself. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that no matter how hard I tried, those excuses were just made up, a weak attempt to cover what was already unraveling.